On the evening when her dignity was most publicly tested, the chandeliers of Ashbourne House burned with a merciless brilliance, as though determined to illuminate every weakness that crossed the polished marble floor. Silk skirts whispered secrets, crystal glasses chimed with careless laughter, and the air itself seemed perfumed with wealth. Into this world stepped Miss Eleanor Hartwell, a woman whose posture betrayed breeding long denied by fortune, and whose calm expression concealed a pulse that beat far too loudly beneath her stays. She had been announced not as a guest but as a petitioner. That single distinction marked her as other, a quiet disruption in a room built upon certainty. The ladies observed her with gloved curiosity, the gentlemen with thinly veiled calculation. Eleanor felt their assessments like cold fingers tracing the seams of her gown, measuring its age, its careful mending, the absence of jewels that might have softened their judgment. She did not lower her gaze. She had learned long ago that looking away only invited further cruelty. At the far end of the room stood the Duke of Ashbourne, unmistakable even among men bred to command attention. He was dressed in severe black, his cravat immaculate, his presence defined less by ornament than by restraint. Where others laughed, he observed. Where others boasted, he listened. His reputation preceded him like a chill draught, exacting, untouchable, and entirely accustomed to obedience. When his eyes settled upon Eleanor, they did so without warmth, yet with a focus that made the room recede. The summons had been brief. She was to present herself, state her qualifications, and accept whatever judgment followed. Eleanor complied with a voice that did not tremble, listing her accomplishments with measured clarity. She spoke of languages mastered, of households managed with discretion, of years spent navigating delicate social arrangements. Each word was precise, economical, offered without appeal. She had come not to beg, but to be considered. As she spoke, memory stirred despite her discipline. She recalled mornings spent teaching herself by candlelight, evenings calculating expenses down to the last coin, years spent learning how to endure without complaint. None of this appeared on her face. Experience had taught her that history, when worn openly, invited dismissal. Composure, however, forced attention. The Duke listened with an expression carved from stone. When she finished, a silence fell, one of those charged pauses in which society leans forward, eager for a verdict. His reply, when it came, cut cleanly through the room. "I can hire 40 like you," he said, his tone even, almost bored, as though stating a simple fact of arithmetic rather than passing judgment on a living soul. A ripple of reaction followed. Some smiled behind their fans, others shifted, sensing the cruelty but unwilling to protest it. Eleanor felt the words strike her chest with a force she had anticipated yet still resented. For a fleeting instant, memory threatened her composure. Her father's library sold piece by piece, her mother's letters unanswered, doors once open now firmly shut. She inhaled, steadying herself, and met the Duke's gaze fully. "Do it," she replied. The simplicity of her answer startled the room into silence. It was not defiant, nor pleading. It was merely final. Eleanor inclined her head, not in submission but acknowledgment, then turned away. Her steps carried her across the floor with deliberate grace, each movement an assertion of control. She did not rush. She would not grant them the satisfaction of haste. Behind her, conversation resumed in fractured murmurs, as though the gathering itself exhaled. Eleanor did not look back. She focused instead on the cool solidity of the door handle beneath her palm, on the faint echo of her heels against stone. With each step, a peculiar lightness took hold, born not of triumph but of release. Whatever illusion she had entertained about fairness within such walls dissolved completely, leaving clarity in its wake. She passed into the corridor, where the opulence softened into shadow. The noise dimmed, replaced by the distant hum of rain against the windows. Eleanor paused, allowing herself one measured breath. Shame still lingered, sharp and undeniable, yet it no longer owned her. She had spoken, and in doing so, reclaimed something that could not be purchased or dismissed. In that quiet space, she acknowledged the cost of her choice. Employment might have eased her circumstances, softened the long uncertainty ahead. Pride offered no such comfort. Yet even as practicality pressed upon her thoughts, she understood she would choose the same path again. Survival without dignity, she had learned, was merely another form of loss. Within the ballroom, the Duke remained where he stood. His expression betrayed nothing, yet those nearest him noticed the slight tightening of his jaw, the faint narrowing of his eyes as he watched the space she had vacated. He had intended dismissal, not departure. The difference unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For the first time in many years, certainty slipped. The Duke found himself recalling the exact cadence of her voice, the restraint in her manner, the quiet steel beneath her politeness. He had measured her worth in numbers, and she had answered with absence. The imbalance gnawed at him, subtle yet insistent, like a misstep in a familiar dance. It was then that he understood, dimly and against his will, that he had not merely refused a woman employment. He had challenged something rarer and far more dangerous than need, self-respect. The realization settled heavily, unwelcome and undeniable, altering the tenor of the evening in ways no apology could undo. Eleanor moved down the corridor toward the exit, unaware that the balance she had upset would not right itself so easily. The words spoken between them hung in the air, heavy with consequence and silent promise, shaping futures neither yet could imagine. She believed the encounter finished, closed like a door behind her. She did not know that for the Duke of Ashbourne, it had only just begun indeed. After that evening, Eleanor Hartwell became a subject of quiet fascination, her name passing from mouth to mouth with the caution reserved for impropriety. In drawing-rooms and along carriage rides, her composure was dissected with avid curiosity. Some condemned her for presumption, others admired her restraint, but all agreed upon one thing: she had unsettled the Duke of Ashbourne. Society sensed disturbance the way birds sense weather, and it leaned eagerly into the change. Eleanor herself returned to modest rooms where the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and lavender soap. Life resumed its practical rhythms, letters written, accounts balanced, errands completed with careful economy. She told herself the encounter had ended as it should have, with clarity rather than compromise. Yet memory proved less obedient. The Duke's voice lingered, not in its cruelty but in its certainty, and she resented how often it returned unbidden. It bore no name, only the unmistakable crest of Ashbourne pressed into deep green wax. Eleanor stared at it longer than necessary, her pulse quickening with a mixture of irritation and unease. She did not open it at once. Instead, she removed her gloves, hung her coat, and allowed the fire to settle before finally breaking the seal. Inside lay a volume bound in worn leather, its pages softened by age and careful use. It was a rare translation she had once mentioned during her interview, a detail too minor to have been coincidence. No note accompanied it. No explanation softened the gesture. The book alone spoke, intimate and unmistakably deliberate. Eleanor closed it slowly, her jaw tightening as she recognized the implication. She returned the parcel that same afternoon, instructing the messenger with quiet firmness. The following day, a bouquet appeared, white roses, arranged with austere elegance. She refused them as well. Each offering felt less like generosity than negotiation, an attempt to redraw the terms of their last exchange without acknowledging the insult that preceded it. The Duke observed these refusals with a patience that surprised even himself. He had not expected gratitude, nor compliance, but resistance intrigued him in ways admiration never had. He ordered inquiries made, discreetly and thoroughly. What he learned complicated matters further. Eleanor Hartwell's fall from comfort was not the result of folly or scandal, but of loyalty misplaced and circumstances cruelly indifferent. Her integrity, once evident, now appeared undeniable. Meanwhile, whispers gathered force. A woman who declined a duke's favor was a novelty, and novelty bred speculation. Why had gifts been sent? Why returned? What history lay unspoken between them? Eleanor felt the weight of these questions in every social encounter, in the averted glances and sudden silences that followed her presence. Reputation, once fractured, proved fragile beyond repair. The tension reached its sharpest point at a modest evening gathering, where Eleanor attended out of necessity rather than inclination. She sensed the shift immediately, the subtle turning of heads, the charged expectancy that settled like fog. When the Duke entered moments later, conversation faltered altogether. He did not approach her. He did not look away. The restraint between them vibrated, visible to anyone attuned to undercurrents. It was the absence of overt action that fueled the scandal most fiercely. No declaration had been made, no indiscretion observed, yet society thrives upon implication. Eleanor understood then that silence could be as damning as confession. The knowledge hardened her resolve even as it threatened her peace. That night, another letter arrived. Unlike the others, this one bore a hand unmistakably human, the ink pressed with controlled urgency. Eleanor hesitated before opening it, aware that whatever lay within might alter the careful distance she had maintained. She read the letter by lamplight, each sentence unfolding with careful restraint. The Duke wrote not to excuse himself, nor to press a claim, but to request a private audience under conditions of propriety so strict they bordered on austere. He acknowledged her refusals without reproach, admitted their justice without apology, and yet confessed, if the word could be applied to such measured prose, that her departure from Ashbourne House had lodged in his thoughts with unwelcome persistence. Eleanor folded the letter once, then twice, and placed it upon the table as though it might burn her fingers. She recognized the danger inherent in such civility. A careless flirtation could be dismissed. A respectful overture demanded answer. Outside her window, rain traced slow paths down the glass, mirroring the steady unraveling of her composure. She had wanted distance, not pursuit refined into courtesy. By the following afternoon, the letter's existence had somehow become known. Eleanor could not trace the breach, only its effects. Invitations cooled. Doors once ajar closed with polite finality. Even the street seemed altered, glances lingering a moment too long. Scandal, she realized, required no proof, only suggestion. Her association with the Duke, however restrained, had marked her indelibly. Across the city, the Duke faced consequences of a different kind. His peers noted his distraction, the pauses in conversation, the restless energy beneath his composure. He had meant to restore balance, to correct a misjudgment quietly. Instead, he found himself drawn deeper into a conflict he could neither command nor dismiss. The more society speculated, the clearer it became that withdrawal would be interpreted as guilt. Eleanor sat at her small writing desk as evening fell, the letter still unanswered. Pride urged refusal. Prudence advised retreat. Yet beneath both stirred a reluctant curiosity, sharpened by the knowledge that silence now carried its own price. She reached for her pen, then stopped, listening to the rain and the distant roll of carriage wheels. Somewhere between resolve and hesitation, she understood that the next word she chose would shape not only rumor, but destiny itself. The carriage rocked gently as it carried Eleanor Hartwell through the rain-slick streets toward the Ashbourne estate, each wheel's turn echoing like a measured heartbeat against the cobblestones. She kept her gloved hands folded in her lap, fingers pressed together with quiet insistence, as though holding herself intact against some unseen strain. The lamps overhead flickered in the wet mist, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the folds of her cloak. Inside, the scent of polished leather and faint smoke mingled, a reminder that she had not yet entered the world where her pride would be tested anew. When the carriage slowed before the grand iron gates, Eleanor caught sight of the familiar silhouette of the Duke, waiting with a dignity that had so unsettled her before. He wore a cloak of dark wool, and the hood shadowed his face, yet his posture betrayed no hesitation, no doubt. It was a deliberate, almost formal invitation, yet she sensed the vulnerability lurking beneath his rigid control. Eleanor exhaled slowly, the cool air filling her lungs, and descended with the grace of one accustomed to walking into rooms that judged rather than welcomed. Inside the estate, the library embraced her with warmth and shadow, a room lined with the quiet authority of books and the soft crackle of a fire newly lit. The Duke stood near the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, eyes lifted to meet hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. He did not greet her with pleasantries, nor did he attempt to mask the weight of the moment. It was as if the room itself had contracted to hold only the two of them, the world outside reduced to murmurs of rain against glass. "Miss Hartwell," he began, his voice low, deliberate, almost hesitant. "You must forgive the presumption of my letters." There was no defensiveness in his tone, only acknowledgment, and for a moment Eleanor sensed a man weighed down by his own awareness of error. She inclined her head slightly, allowing a trace of her earlier reserve to surface. "Your letters were received, my lord. I have read them carefully," she replied, her voice steady, yet carrying the undercurrent of tension she could not entirely disguise. "I presume that this meeting is not to discuss propriety, but necessity." The words were polite, formal, but Eleanor allowed them to carry a sharper edge than etiquette might suggest. She would not surrender her dignity here, nor allow it to be borrowed without her consent. The Duke's gaze softened, though only imperceptibly, and he moved a step closer to the hearth. "Necessity," he murmured, almost to himself. Perhaps I have been mistaken in my judgments." His hands remained clasped, yet the rigidity of his form betrayed the effort required to contain what he would not yet voice. Eleanor felt a shiver of cautious anticipation, aware that the line between confession and manipulation was perilously thin. "I have endured many misjudgments," she said quietly, "most of them public, most of them uninvited. I do not make light of error, my lord, nor do I forgive it easily. I have learned the measure of patience and the value of restraint." Her words were carefully chosen, each one a shield and a signal simultaneously, and she met his gaze without flinching. The Duke lowered his head for a moment, as if considering the weight of her reply, then looked up again with an intensity that caught her breath. "You left Ashbourne House with more than composure, Miss Hartwell," he said, the formality of address sharpening the confession that followed. "You left with the assertion of self-possession I have rarely encountered. It unsettled me more than it should have." Eleanor's fingers tightened in her lap. The firelight danced across the dark lines of his face, illuminating the unexpected vulnerability he had allowed to surface. "You assume much, my lord," she said softly, though her voice carried no accusation. "I left because my pride demanded it. I have no desire to be valued merely for need, nor to be preserved for convenience." He nodded slowly, as if her words cleared a path he had feared to tread. "I understand that now," he said, each syllable deliberate, measured. "And yet, I cannot help but acknowledge the extent to which your absence has altered my perspective. I underestimated the gravity of a woman who refuses subjugation, and I did so at the peril of my own sensibilities." There was a pause, long enough for Eleanor to sense that each word was plucked from a place of rare honesty, a careful exposure of the man behind the reputation. "You speak of sensibilities," Eleanor observed, "yet you presume to measure mine as well." Her voice was calm, yet her heart thumped in recognition of the intimacy unfolding, a dangerous closeness framed by propriety and restraint. The fire crackled, as if punctuating the tension that stretched between them, and the library seemed to contract further, enclosing them in a space both private and charged. "I measure nothing without consent," he said, the faintest trace of remorse threading through his tone. "I merely observe what is impossible to ignore. You possess a dignity, Miss Hartwell, that defies expectation. It challenges the conventions I have long taken for granted, and it is compelling." His admission hung in the air, delicate and dangerous, as if the walls themselves feared its weight. Eleanor allowed herself a fraction of a smile, not for triumph, but for recognition. She understood, at last, the true nature of the game they were engaged in, one of silence, measured words, and unspoken truths. "Compelling is not a gift to be wielded lightly, my lord," she said. "It carries responsibility. For both parties." He inclined his head, the movement subtle yet deliberate. "I accept that responsibility," he said quietly. If only you might allow me the chance to prove it." There was a vulnerability in the phrasing that Eleanor had not anticipated, a momentary crack in the armor of power and control. She studied him, noting the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the measured care of his words. She recognized, finally, that the man before her was not merely a figure of wealth and authority, but a soul capable of reflection, regret, and desire restrained by circumstance. Yet she also knew that vulnerability, once exposed, demanded caution, and that every step forward carried the weight of past humiliation and present expectation. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the subtle hiss of the fire, the faint tapping of rain against the windows, and the distant toll of a clock somewhere beyond the walls. Eleanor sensed that the encounter had shifted something irreversibly, though the direction of that shift remained uncertain. She could choose retreat, or she could allow herself to remain, balancing on the delicate line between restraint and surrender. At last, she rose, the movement deliberate, drawing attention to her poise rather than the tremor beneath it. "I will consider your words," she said, voice steady, measured, yet carrying a weight that left no doubt of their significance. "And I will decide, as I always have, by my own judgment." The Duke inclined his head in acknowledgment, a gesture both formal and intimate, and for the first time Eleanor perceived a flicker of uncertainty in him that mirrored her own. The firelight caught in his eyes, and she realized that the moment had altered them both. She turned toward the door, pausing only to offer a single backward glance, sharp and fleeting, a question left unasked, a boundary maintained yet bridged. As she stepped into the corridor, Eleanor felt the tension of expectation pressing against her spine, the memory of his gaze following with deliberate insistence. The air outside the library, though cooler, felt charged, as though the estate itself had acknowledged the private reckoning that had taken place within its walls. The rain continued its quiet patter, unrelenting yet soothing, and she understood that her next choice would carry consequences neither she nor the Duke could yet fully anticipate. In that suspended moment, Eleanor Hartwell walked onward, both challenged and awakened, aware that the scales of power had shifted in a manner both subtle and irreversible, and that the game they had begun would demand courage beyond mere propriety. The grand ballroom of Ashbourne House shimmered under the weight of 100 crystal chandeliers, each prism casting fractured rainbows upon the polished floor. Music drifted lazily from a quartet tucked into the corner, violins and cello entwining in a melody that promised elegance yet carried the faint undercurrent of longing. Eleanor Hartwell entered with measured steps, the rustle of her silk gown almost lost beneath the ambient hum of conversation. Every eye that fell upon her traced the lines of her posture, the steadiness of her gaze, the deliberate calm that refused to waver. She had come not for ceremony, nor for frivolity, but to reclaim ground that had long been ceded to whispers and rumor. The Duke observed her from across the room, positioned near the marble staircase that led to his private gallery. He wore a dark coat cut with precise tailoring, cravat set at a rigid angle, gloves pale against the black of his hands. Yet for all his outward composure, his eyes betrayed the turmoil of the past weeks. He had intended to maintain propriety, to contain his fascination within boundaries imposed by society and duty, but her presence shifted the air with quiet insistence. For the first time, the ballroom seemed less a stage for spectacle than a theater in which every glance, every gesture, bore consequence. Eleanor moved with deliberate grace, acknowledging the bows and murmured greetings with a single nod, her attention focused entirely on the Duke. She had rehearsed every conceivable strategy, every potential line of defense or concession, yet none seemed adequate for the storm of emotion that had accompanied her decision to attend. Her pride had been tested, her resolve refined by weeks of deliberate reflection, yet anticipation coiled in her chest like a live thing, reminding her that courage could be as fragile as crystal beneath such scrutiny. The Duke took a slow step forward as she approached, the distance between them collapsing under the weight of expectation. "Miss Hartwell," he said, voice low but carrying across the immediate vicinity, commanding attention without raising volume. "You honor us all by your presence tonight." His words, formally courteous, bore the undercurrent of something far more personal, an acknowledgment that extended beyond mere etiquette. Eleanor inclined her head slightly, recognizing the layered meaning behind the choice of phrasing. She permitted no outward display, though inwardly, her pulse betrayed the impact. "You overstate the matter, my lord," she replied evenly, her voice carrying across the gap with deliberate clarity. "I attend as any guest might. My honor compels no greater distinction." The words were true, yet layered with the subtlety of challenge. She refused to grant him the satisfaction of perceiving need where none existed, asserting herself without antagonism, a balance refined by weeks of careful observation and measured self-discipline. He studied her, eyes narrowing imperceptibly, and for a moment the ballroom seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in a suspended world of restraint and expectation. "You are unlike any woman I have encountered," he said finally, stepping closer, allowing his voice to soften without losing the weight of authority. "Your composure, your intelligence, your refusal to yield, these compel reflection, though I have resisted it longer than propriety allows." There was no flourish, no dramatization. Every word was deliberate, resonant, and precise, yet beneath the formality lay the unmistakable tremor of unguarded sentiment. Eleanor regarded him steadily, recognizing the risk inherent in his admission. "Compulsion is a dangerous thing," she said, her voice quiet but deliberate, carrying both warning and curiosity. One may compel attention without granting allegiance, and one may provoke interest without surrendering trust. Her words were measured, yet each carried the weight of experience, the lessons of endurance, and the quiet authority of self-possession. A faint shadow crossed the Duke's face, as though her words had pierced armor he had not yet realized he wore. "Then allow me, Miss Hartwell," he said, tone softened but unwavering, "to be judged by that standard. Allow me to act with regard for your judgment, and not merely my own desire." There was a pause, a tension that drew the eyes of a few nearby observers even as most remained oblivious, caught in the swell of music and opulence. Yet Eleanor perceived every subtle shift, every slight intonation, every unspoken implication. She stepped closer, closing the remaining space with a grace that acknowledged both propriety and intent. "And if I find that your actions fail to meet that measure?" she asked, voice steady, though her pulse quickened. The question was formal, framed in restraint, yet loaded with the quiet challenge of history, pride, and careful scrutiny. "Then I shall accept the judgment, as earnestly as I now confess the challenge you have presented to me," he replied, his voice low, deliberate, intimate. There was no boast, no arrogance, only acknowledgment of the balance she demanded and the respect she had earned. Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle upon her, a recognition of authority tempered by the admission of vulnerability. They stood together, the music swelling around them, the firelight casting shadows that flickered across their faces, highlighting lines of intensity, subtle gestures, and the quiet acknowledgment of mutual scrutiny. The room, for all its grandeur, seemed reduced to a private space, a theater in which every glance and every measured step held the gravity of unspoken history and delicate possibility. Eleanor felt the familiar tension that accompanied her confrontations with society, here amplified by the undeniable intimacy of shared recognition. The Duke's hand, gloved and firm, extended slightly, not in command but in invitation, a gesture formal yet charged. Eleanor regarded it, understanding that the moment demanded a response not merely of politeness, but of courage and conviction. She allowed herself a small, deliberate inclination of acceptance, acknowledging the connection without surrendering her self-possession. "Then it is settled," he said, tone quiet but resonant, carrying authority and acknowledgment alike. "Not in haste, nor by convenience, but by consideration, reflection, and recognition. I offer what respect and regard I may command, and no less." His words were measured, deliberate, and irrevocable, leaving no room for misinterpretation or dismissal. Eleanor felt the balance shift under the weight of his declaration, the dynamic between them transformed from challenge to acknowledgment, from hesitation to deliberate engagement. Her response, tempered with dignity and precision, mirrored the gravity of the moment. "Then I accept, with the understanding that every future measure must honor the same principles," she said, voice steady, carrying the weight of experience, the lessons of endurance, and the careful calibration of pride and desire. There was no exuberance, no flight into sentimentality, only acknowledgment, equilibrium, and the quiet triumph of mutual understanding. Around them, the ballroom continued its rhythm, oblivious to the subtle transformation at its center. Yet for Eleanor and the Duke, the evening had shifted irreversibly, each decision and measured word marking a new trajectory. Respect, recognition, and restrained affection had converged, leaving in their wake a profound, delicate resolution. The air between them carried the promise of a partnership forged not by submission, but by deliberate acknowledgment of worth and principle. As the music swelled toward a gentle diminuendo, Eleanor stepped back slightly, allowing space while maintaining presence. She met his gaze one final time, and in that shared look lay the unspoken acknowledgment of challenge, revelation, and the weight of the journey still to come. The subtle tension between past slight and future potential remained, a reminder that the resolution was not a conclusion, but a carefully wrought bridge to what might follow. Outside the window, the night pressed against the glass, heavy with rain and the quiet murmur of distant streets. The grandeur of the ballroom faded in her perception, replaced by the intimacy of recognition, the quiet acknowledgment of power balanced by restraint. Eleanor understood, at last, that the declaration had been made, and that resolution was achieved, yet the path forward remained both uncertain and irresistible. As she turned to leave, the Duke's voice followed her, soft and deliberate, carrying both command and invitation. "Consider well, Miss Hartwell. The choice is yours, yet know that the moment has altered more than circumstance. It has altered understanding, expectation, and possibility. Eleanor paused, her hand upon the door, the words sinking into the quiet spaces of her reflection. She stepped into the corridor, aware that every future step bore the weight of this night, and that the bridge they had built between pride and desire was strong, yet delicate, awaiting her next move with quiet insistence. The first light of dawn crept through the tall windows of Ashbourne House, casting long, soft beams across the polished floorboards of the drawing-room. Eleanor Hartwell stood near the hearth, the fire reduced to embers that glowed with a muted warmth, a quiet echo of the intensity that had passed between them in the days prior. Her gown, though simple, caught the light in subtle ripples, as if the fabric itself were alive with anticipation. Outside, the garden lay wet with dew, each blade of grass sparkling as though the world had paused to witness the moment to come. Eleanor's hands rested lightly on the table, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, steadying herself against the weight of expectation. The Duke of Ashbourne entered without announcement, his footsteps soft against the rug yet deliberate, each one a testament to control and careful purpose. He removed his gloves, placing them neatly on the console table, and folded his hands behind his back in a posture that suggested both authority and restraint. For a long moment, he observed her without speech, as though measuring the precise balance between courage and caution, pride and desire. Eleanor returned his gaze without flinching, a calm determination in her eyes, though the rapid beat of her pulse betrayed the storm beneath the surface. "I trust the morning finds you well," he said finally, voice quiet but resonant, carrying the weight of unspoken history. There was no ceremony in the tone, only the acknowledgment of shared understanding. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "I have slept with the assurance of clarity," she replied, her voice composed, carrying both steadiness and the subtle edge of anticipation. "Though clarity, as ever, bears the weight of choice." He moved closer, each step measured, the space between them collapsing with the inevitability of gravity. "Then let us speak plainly," he said. "Not in the language of society, nor in the artifice of expectation, but in the truth that has long lingered between us." His words struck the room with a quiet intensity, drawing the past weeks into sharp relief. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, and she allowed herself a single exhalation, feeling the tension that had accumulated over letters, gifts, and stolen glances finally begin to release. "Speak then," she said, voice steady, yet threaded with a faint tremor of curiosity. "And know that I shall hear with neither indulgence nor prejudice. The truth must stand upon its own merit." He inclined his head, acknowledging her command, and for a long moment neither moved. Outside, the morning light shifted, brushing gold across the garden, illuminating the delicate frost that clung to the edges of leaves and petals. The world held its breath. "Miss Hartwell," he began, voice low, deliberate, almost trembling with the restraint he imposed upon himself, "I have been foolish. I have relied upon authority and reputation as shields, believing they could contain desire and dictate conduct. Yet you have dismantled them with quiet constancy. Your refusal to yield, your dignity in the face of affront, your measured courage, these have unsettled me beyond expectation. I find myself compelled to confess that my admiration has transformed into something I cannot dismiss." Eleanor's gaze softened imperceptibly, though her posture remained firm. She recognized in his words the rare acknowledgment of vulnerability, the kind that men of station seldom allowed themselves. "Compulsion, my lord, is no gift," she said, her voice calm, carrying the weight of both warning and intrigue. "It requires recognition and consent. Without the latter, it becomes burden rather than honor." He knelt then, not in supplication, nor in ceremonial display, but in the quiet submission of one who acknowledges the gravity of consequence. The firelight caught the angles of his face, highlighting the tension of control held at bay, the lines of thought carved deeply by weeks of reflection and unspoken longing. "I seek only acknowledgment," he said, voice low, resonant, trembling with the restraint of feeling finally expressed. "I offer respect, consideration, and sincerity, nothing less. I ask that you receive it as such, not as imposition but as testament to the esteem I hold for you." Eleanor felt the warmth of the room fold around her, the embers casting a glow upon both their faces. For the first time, she perceived the full measure of what had passed, the subtle dance of power and restraint, pride and recognition, risk and courage. Her fingers itched to reach toward him, yet she maintained distance, allowing the moment to preserve its delicate tension. "Then the matter rests upon my judgment," she said finally, voice steady, deliberate. "Not upon sentiment alone, but upon the measure of honor, intention, and understanding you have laid before me." A pause followed, in which the world seemed suspended. Outside, birds stirred in the garden, the gentle rustle of leaves whispering against window panes. The Duke remained kneeling, awaiting her decision, the very embodiment of patience and restraint, and Eleanor felt the weight of her choice press upon her chest like the delicate pressure of a finely tuned scale. "I accept," she said at last, the words deliberate, tempered by both conviction and care. Not for convenience, nor for display, but with the understanding that equality, respect, and shared integrity will guide what follows. Every action, every word, every gesture shall be measured against that standard. Relief and restrained triumph passed through the Duke's features, though he allowed himself no flourish, no overt celebration. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate, the measured acknowledgement of victory tempered by the awareness of the journey yet to come. "Then let it be known," he said quietly, "that what has been commenced shall continue in earnest, guided by principle and tempered by honor. Let us move forward, not as master and supplicant, but as equals navigating the fragile promise we have forged." Eleanor nodded once, sharply, her own relief tempered by the recognition of the responsibility she now bore. She understood that acceptance carried consequence, the careful balance of emotion, propriety, and expectation. The embers of the fire glowed warmly at her back, the soft light catching in her eyes as she regarded the man who had once sought to measure her worth by convenience alone. Now, however, the measure was mutual, deliberate, and irrevocable. For a long moment, they stood together, the silence between them not empty but resonant, filled with acknowledgment, promise, and subtle power. Outside, the morning light shifted, illuminating the edges of the estate garden, the soft dew glittering like a delicate testament to patience and endurance. Eleanor understood fully, in that quiet, suspended interval, that the legacy of the moment would extend far beyond the walls of Ashbourne House, shaping reputation, conduct, and future choice alike. The Duke extended his hand, gloved and firm, and Eleanor accepted it with careful grace, neither yielding nor dominating, but acknowledging the equality they had claimed together. The gesture, simple yet profound, bridged the space between assertion and submission, pride and recognition, courage and acknowledgment. The firelight flickered upon their joined hands, as if the universe itself approved of the fragile equilibrium achieved. Music drifted faintly from the ballroom, distant now, as though the world outside waited in gentle anticipation. Eleanor inhaled deeply, sensing the shift in every sense, the weight of expectation, the clarity of choice, the resonance of honor preserved and shared. The path before them was uncertain, yet illuminated by a foundation of deliberate intent and mutual acknowledgment, and she felt, for the first time in weeks, the rare thrill of unburdened hope. As she prepared to step away from the hearth, the Duke's voice followed her, quiet yet insistent, carrying the full measure of promise and consequence. "The journey has begun, Miss Hartwell. Every step we take henceforth shall be guided by the principles we have acknowledged. Yet know this, the world watches, and we must navigate it with care, courage, and unyielding regard." Eleanor paused at the doorway, the morning light pooling around her like a halo of fragile certainty. She cast a final glance at the Duke, a look that carried acknowledgment, expectation, and the faintest hint of something unspoken yet shared. The future stretched before them, uncertain, yet charged with possibility, and she understood fully that this moment, so quietly wrought, so deliberately claimed, would mark both their lives indelibly. Stepping into the corridor, Eleanor felt the press of anticipation and reflection intertwining, the subtle echo of the past mingling with the promise of what lay ahead. Behind her, the Duke remained near the hearth, resolute yet contemplative, the firelight flickering across the contours of a man who had learned, at last, that power measured in wealth and title was nothing compared to the currency of respect, recognition, and carefully wrought affection. The door closed softly behind her, and in that gentle click, the room seemed to exhale, carrying with it the weight of past humiliation, present reckoning, and future promise. The game of propriety and desire, of pride and vulnerability, had reached its turning point. Yet in the quiet shadow of the corridor, Eleanor sensed that while resolution had been achieved, the delicate dance of trust, expectation, and intimacy had only just begun, waiting to unfold with deliberate care.